What I'd like to do now is the discussion and Q&A session, and people can come up to the microphones if they like and identify themselves and ask some questions. Also, questions can be directed to people on the previous panels that are in the audience. You don't need to come up here, but you can direct them to whoever's in the room. I have to ask a question, Peter, Wynn, and Jack. Before we start, I'm impressed by the detail of knowledge that you had about the implications of the dosing and the test and the clinical trial. I'm really curious to know from each of you, what did you hear this morning that you didn't know about or that surprised you? Maybe nothing, which is fine, but
No, I was for myself. I was pleased to know that there was so much attention to the ethics matters relating to clinical trials, as we saw displayed this morning in the presentations. And so much thought is given to that. I wasn't aware of the depth of that type of consideration given to the clinical trials. I don't know if that's typical at every university. I'm not qualified to say. It probably isn't. You seem to have more experience with that here than most. But I was impressed with that. I'm happy to hear that. Happy to hear that outline. That was news to me.
Peter?
It was new to me, but that was just an accident. I mean, the last 6 months I've been working on a case involving manipulation of clinical trials. So I just have spent a lot of time with people like Dr. Kane who have explained to me the ways in which the process can be manipulated.
Ron?
Perhaps because I'm an academic,
You want to identify yourself, Ron?
it seems to me I'm a nephrologist, an internist with interest in kidney disease, dialysis, transplant, and the issues in that field of medicine led me to be very concerned about the ethical issues in medicine and to return to the university after 17 years of private practice to start a program in medical ethics. What I wanted to say is that perhaps because I'm an academic, it seems to me the balance of this conference has heavily weighted industry as the bad guy. And it seems to me that there's far too little attention to the conflict of interest of academics, publish or perish, to be respected or not. And I would call attention to a wonderful New England Journal of Medicine editorial by Norm Levinsky some years ago about this professional conflict of interest and the potential for bias, as was pointed out, for skewing studies in a variety of ways. I would hope, usually unintentionally, but nevertheless driven by the forces of nature, the conflicts of interest that don't necessarily have to lead to bias, but do so very strongly unconsciously.
Well, I don't think it didn't seem to me that from this conference, at least in my opinion, much of this we were talking about was necessarily industry being the bad guy, because it takes two to tango. It takes the supply side, as they say, to agree with things. And the physician that's lost the true fiduciary view of the patient. So their industry's job is to make a profit. Physician's job is to treat the patient as the only true endpoint. So
I didn't mean to imply that you rigged the conference.
no,
Rather, and perhaps again, because of my particular location, I'm particularly sensitive to this in that the University of California has adopted as of July 1 a new has the same kinds of unintended consequences that HIPAA has had, and a wonderful intent, but nevertheless a policy really badly flawed by its unintended consequences.
Just want oh, go ahead.
I tried to touch upon that in my remarks because I do believe that academia is certainly, as the title of your symposium here today states, is a full part of the program here, whether they're problematic or not. My own view is that the problem in academia is not that there are not well-written and well-thought-out ethics rules. I don't think they're being enforced very well. And phase one of that was when we saw a few years ago that a number of prominent government scientists at NIH and elsewhere were not reporting substantial amounts of income they were receiving from the pharmaceutical companies and medical device companies as they were required to do. The reaction to that was for Elias Zerhouni, the director of NIH, to substantially tighten those ethics rules and their enforcement to the point where there was a lot of pushback from within NIH that they were becoming too strict. Phase two of this, I think, is what Senator Grassley is now looking into. There are very specific rules about clinical trials and IRBs, institutional review boards, about academics reporting the outside income that they receive. Senator Grassley's staff is finding out in recent months from asking the drug and medical device companies how much they're giving prominent researchers that many of them are not reporting large amounts of income. One Harvard psychiatrist failed to report more than $1 million worth of outside income. Now, when that happened at NIH, that researcher was put under criminal investigation because he was required by law to report that income, and he failed to do so. I don't know what's going to happen in academia. That is up to the university community because it's not as federal employees. This researcher is not necessarily going to be disciplined for that as far as I'm concerned.
I'm struggling with the idea that transparency is the answer. And the reason, and I'm curious the panel's perception, and the reason why I ask is some folks have feel that doctors and physicians may not, they want their patients to be a part, patients want their doctors to be a part, and patients may not change their behavior one way or another. If it doesn't change the behavior, what's the value of the transparency? And why do you think transparency is the solution to that? Because hopefully we never have to have too many people here. There's going to be a few that we're going to have to go outside of together, but we want to change behavior. We want to change behavior. So the question is transparency the solution?
I'm probably the least appropriate person to respond to that, but I'd like to respond anyway. Probably the question really goes to Jack and the industry in terms of whether as a policy matter transparency works or doesn't work. But when you were asking me that question, what really jumped into my mind was what the former doctor, and I can't remember your last name, you're the nephrologist, but you've been practicing for a while, and your comment about HIPAA, your comment about the government's attempt to address what is really something that was self-regulating for a while. I mean, in the past, younger doctors would work with older doctors who had, as Benjamin Franklin said, they sort of established their practices so they weren't quite as desperate to pay off their student loans. And their job, the older doctors, as when I learned practice law, I hung out with older lawyers who taught me how to do the same things. To teach them the ethics of the community, the ethics of the profession, that certain things are just not done. Okay? As a prosecutor, I don't buy stocks from companies that investigate, right? Think of an investigator who, has a significant financial interest in the company who's sponsoring research. Now, there was a time in medicine where if you came up with an invention, there was an ethic where you just were expected to simply give that patent to the public, okay? Exactly. And so, and I'm not saying that every culture is different or every, I mean, but the point is that there was, the governmental involvement in regulatory, in trying to regulate what really is an ethical ecosystem. Ideally, it ought to self-regulate. And the principles that infuse that self-regulation, the older physicians helping the younger physicians learn the ethical culture of the profession, what it means to be a profession, what our identity is as a profession, right? That has been sufficiently neglected in this community so that the regulatory community starts to engage in an attempt to use really inappropriate mechanisms at some level. Rules, prosecutions, public humiliation. I mean, there's all sorts of different versions of that. But none of them are nearly as effective as that the older physician teaching the younger physician, or the older lawyer teaching the younger lawyer, what it really means to be a professional. So I would respond to your question by saying, would that you didn't need to use a rule like disclosure, right? I mean, Hippocrates didn't stitch his patients off, okay? You didn't need HIPAA because physicians knew that if the patients didn't trust you to tell the truth, they weren't going to tell you the truth. So you had to keep their confidences, and that's part of what it meant to be a professional, right? So things started to break down, and you get a regulatory response, which is both over-inclusive and under-inclusive and expensive and a lot of problems. But the ideal is to have a situation where the regulatory community can be sensitive to a culture, sensitive to the ecosystem, and push in exactly the right amount of effort to kind of ease the ecosystem back to where it should have been and has gotten off track. And to the extent I was trying to say anything in my talk, it was to try to, let's get more focused on who we are as professionals. If we stay focused on that, if the older people in the community can really sort of take upon themselves the responsibility to go to the younger people in the community and make sure they learn the right ethics. A lot of governmental oversight will not be necessary. I can go back to prosecuting bank robbers.
I just want to comment a bit on the transparency piece, then come back to Ron's question earlier.
If I could just address for 1 second, if I could also address your question from a legislative perspective, which is to say that we can argue about whether or not a patient, knowing that a certain physician or surgeon received $500,000, say, to develop or help promote a particular procedure or device, is influenced by that, and whether that might influence their own decision about whether or not to have a particular surgery, which in many of these cases are experimental surgeries, even if they're approved. That's one issue. We can argue about whether or not the more important issue, I believe, is that what the lack of transparency causes. The lack of transparency is what got Mr. Phipps, obviously a highly able attorney in his company, into trouble. The lack of transparency put them in a situation where the U.S. attorney came in and said, I'm subpoenaing all your documents for the last 6 or 7 years, and you're going to have to prove to us that in thousands of these transactions, that each and every one of these payments was for what you said it was. And if I prove you wrong on one of those, and you get one felony count, you are going to be barred from Medicare. And in Zimmer's case, that would probably highly damage, if not destroy, the company, and he can rebut that if he wishes. But I think it's fair to say that Mr. Phipps' testimony before our committee said as much. He said we couldn't take that risk. I can't, as the lead lawyer of the company, take that risk. I don't know. I think that we did most things legitimately, but there's thousands of them out there. He's got all our documents. Maybe our sales force did a couple things they shouldn't have. And we're putting our company at risk. All those companies were at risk because they were doing non-transparent transactions of tens of millions of dollars for legitimate reasons that they believed were good. But some of that got twisted and influenced by marketing decisions, as they've admitted. And so that's what the lack of transparency causes, and that's caused a 3 or 4 year investigation, costing a lot of money, and it's cost these companies $400 million. So I think that's why the additional transparency is needed, so that we know who's getting what and how much.
Mike, did you
Even
want
if
to
they're
say?
arriving at their own decisions.
My question is that in meaning that in the changing morals and values of today's society, transparency may not be enough to actually change behavior. And that is the ultimate goal, is we want to change behavior structure. These things that which actually truly disturbing to the core of limitations and American society does not trust institutions the way it used to. And that aspect, and that's what I'm saying, is that these transparency are enough, not that.
At the corporate level, it's clear that you can't look at policies that you like because the desire to be avoid policy. But transparency becomes quite the term in ethics, philosophy, and public policy, really. And there are a couple of problems underlying it. First of all, on a personal level, transparency assumes that you know your bias, that you can detect your bias within yourself. And studies clearly demonstrate that physicians don't believe they are being biased, that they have biases. And I teach a whole class of this with my students, and the students hold a self-reflection, and the students come and tell me they're objective, and then they can separate their personal beliefs from their professional practice. And when I watch them, like their mentors, I clearly see the influence of their personal beliefs on the way they practice medicine. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. But what can be bad is that they don't know it and can't identify it. So if you want to change behavior, I think you have to start with the awareness. Now, at the corporate level, the awareness is easier. But on a personal level, it's much more difficult.
Yeah, I'd like to tell a story about this in a second. Mike, some
Well,
comments?
okay, a couple of quick ones. So I think Ranjan's last point is an important one about transparency, as whether that's all we need. And I think, whether what that should look like is one question, but obviously we need more. One of the rules of ethicists is not to necessarily provide people with answers, but to give them more things to think about. And one of those is that there are a couple of studies now that have shown that if you turn to people who are potentially going to enroll in a clinical trial, and you tell them that the people who are running the clinical trial have financial conflicts of interest, instead of being less likely to enroll, they'll be more likely to enroll, because they think these people have these financial interests, they're going to want to do a better job on it. I've asked my graduates, the graduate students in my courses, about what they would do if they saw a research paper that showed that there were financial conflicts of interest of the authors, and some, but not all, only a few, but some always in each class, would say they would be more trusting of the paper because these people have got, they've done well enough to get money from the company, they're putting this out there so that they're going to be more attentive because they know they're being watched. And so that's one reason, that's an argument why maybe transparency isn't exactly the answer we think it's going to be. The flip side of that is that if you have transparency, my guess is, and I think we're hearing from everybody, that when people, by transparency I mean that you let people know what you're doing, you have your records open, you talk about not just your money, but the research is open so that you aren't keeping it closed and hidden, then there's an increased likelihood that in the process, if you've also disclosed that you have that financial interest, you will pay more attention because people can see what you're doing. You don't want to be on the front page of the New York Times. But if I may, because we got away from Ron's question, I think we got onto two different kinds of worries. I think Ron was worrying that as academics, we have other interests than financial that might result in bias. I think it's an extraordinarily important question, and one that perhaps one idea would be if the university can have a policy about not taking pens from vendors, then perhaps we need a policy in the university that says something about the quality of publications instead of the quantity, or something that will have us start to focus more on the integrity and quality of what we do instead of counting numbers and papers. That would be my suggestion of how to deal with the internal issues.
Before I take Stuart's question, I just want to mention one funny story about setting up this symposium. I asked a lot of people from different areas about being here. Some agreed that they would come. And then when they found out, one person, well-known, surgeon, not from this area, of course, and found out, as I was saying, you have to reveal in detail what you get from industry. And he said, maybe it was a she, that I can't do that. No one would listen to me anymore. And that's a quote. So I think people do know their biases and that it does affect them. Stuart?
Yeah, I think it's important for Senators Grassley and Cole to recognize that there's really two kinds of payment issues that are involved here, and then there's kind of a gray area in between. And it's important to distinguish those two. One is in the, what I call the empty landscape in my talk, the kind of developmental things that are going on with new products that need to be developed in order to advance clinical science. But there's something else that Chad, your name is Chad, is that right?
Yes.
Referred to in a kind of a vague way that is extremely important for people in this room to understand how this works, okay? And what we're talking about is mature products, okay? Mature total knee replacements and mature total hip replacements. Those products, by this convergent evolution process, it's virtually impossible to distinguish one company's product from another. If I took all the total knees from Zimmer, Smith & Nephew, Stryker, and Comedic, I laid them on the table, scratched off their name with a piece of sandpaper, I doubt that Chad could say, that's my company's product, okay? Because that's just the way it is. Those are mature products. These products cost about $5,000, let's say, to put into a patient between the various components of it, right? That's what the hospital is paying the company. Of that $5,000, 10% goes to the rep who is servicing that account, all right? That doctor, that hospital. So that guy's going to get $500 for that implant. His distributor, if it's a kind of distributorship system, because some companies have different arrangements, is also going to get $500. Now what that guy sees is there's two doctors in the hospital, and there's one guy that's using the competitor's product that is doing 8 cases a week, okay? And so what the sales rep thinks is, gee, if I could get that guy's business, that's 500 times 8 that's going to be in my pocket. And so what he says is, he realizes the surgeon really doesn't care that much because it's the same, the products are virtually indistinguishable. I mean, you said that your sales force is going to focus on showing the benefits of your product and why your product is a superior product. Well, that's like basically trying to pump up the Lexus guys compared to the Acura guys, compared to the BMW guys, and compared to the Mercedes guys. I mean, we're talking about products that are pretty much equivalent across the marketplace because the results are like 96% successful, no matter which product you put in. And the unsuccessful ones are due to blood clots, they're due to hemorrhaging, they're due to kind of medical things, not really the design of the product itself. And so basically the sales rep says, gee, if I can convince that guy to use my product, that puts another 500 times 8 in my pocket per week if the guy's doing 8 cases. So what he does is he approaches the surgeon, or she approaches the surgeon, and says, well, you know, you have a foundation, maybe you like Laker tickets or something like that, that equals to about $100 per implant. Okay? And now that is this is the kind of mature product money that's going on at the marketing end. And now he convinces that doctor to switch over and to use his product. And now he puts the other guy out of business. The other sales rep starts to complain, and now he comes back and he says, well, I'll put $200 into your foundation, your family foundation, or your research fund. I'll give you tickets to the Lakers and to the Angels, or something like that. And it's kind of, this is what's going on in the real world marketplace, or at least what was going on in the real world marketplace. And a lot of it has to do with the enormous cost of these implants. The same implant, by the way, is something in Scandinavia, where they have a socialized medical system, or a similar one for about $500. But that's basically what's going on. And that has to be stopped. And I think that's one of the purposes of this transparency bit. But there's something else going on, and that is surgeons who have a lot of experience are teaching other doctors how to use these products correctly. All right? And they're being paid to do that because they're away from their office in order to run these workshops. I mean, you can't have salesmen teaching surgeons how to do the operation. It doesn't work out that way. Also, you have problems with some of these products sometimes, particularly the newer products. And if you just let the engineers develop these products, you get some gigantic piece of thing you're supposed to put inside a little tiny knee joint. I mean, they come up with very strange things, the engineers, when they're working by themselves. You're not talking to the doctors constantly. So I think you have to distinguish between those two kinds of payment systems. And I'm not so sure the transparency issue, I mean, what you may end up doing is you've got your developer, innovator kind of surgeons on one side, and they're the ones who are so concerned about ethics. I mean, they're university affiliated, and they're going to say, geez, I don't want to be involved in this process. Oh, it doesn't look good to have my name out there with $50,000 worth of consulting agreements and so forth and so on. And so those are the guys that are going to back away from this system, whereas the ones you really are trying to target, which are the guys who are asking for the Laker tickets in order to switch products, are the ones that they're just going to do it anyway. They're going to figure out some other way to do it. And so I think you have to kind of make that clear distinction as to exactly what's going on in the way in which these sunshine laws come down, particularly the intent of the sunshine laws.
Well,
What do you think?
I've had a fair amount of experience in sort of those two, we've got a spectrum on this.
Right.
One end of the spectrum, we start with bribes. The other end of the spectrum, we're starting with the study budget. The problem is that as you prosecute the bribes, the study budget, the bribes move into the study budget. So the study budget itself, in a study, you haven't actually used your budget. So, it creates sort of little slush funds floating around. Again, I don't want to get into the question of disclosure or not disclosure. I think there's a lot of good things disclosure does. A lot of maybe people rely too much on disclosure to do things you can't do. But I would just emphasize within the community of professionals, you know who's getting the bribes, and you know which people are doing the real research. You know. And you can call bullshit on that if you want.
Yeah, I'll just respond from industry's perspective. First of all, I agree with about half of the things you said. There's about a lot of facts in there that aren't true, assuming they are true for this point. I'll just address your comment. But one, there are differences in these products, and I'm a general counsel, I'm an attorney, I'm not the one to talk to, but you sit down, most people in these companies, they would be able to differentiate based on the materials that are used and other things. But it's also very much a service industry. And when you buy our implant, what you get is also a service package, including the rep in the OR that's standing there with the pointer saying, there's 20 instrument trays in there, which instruments go with it. So I do agree with you, though, that you do have to distinguish between what we've been focusing on today, and that's kind of the consulting services from the marketing practices. And we don't think transparency is the solution to everything. It's kind of the final piece of the puzzle from our standpoint. I mean, it really gets back to, is there a need for that study or for that other service in the first place? Are the people or the institutions being chosen for the right reasons on an objective basis to fit that need? Are the services being performed? There's cases I've heard of where studies were paid for and the study results were never even delivered, but yet the money was paid. Are you paying fair market value for those services? And then finally, once all that's in place, the service is performed, the payments extended, then you have transparency. It goes to your point. Transparency is not the be-all, end-all. It's a piece of it that kind of comes at the end. But as far as marketing practices, I think you get into a lot of the same issues, though. You cannot, under the anti-kickback statute and otherwise, you can't give something of value to try to influence someone's purchasing decision. And that's a different issue. And I don't know how transparency comes into that world, but the same types of safeguards that you're putting in place on your consulting side need to be in place on your marketing side. So.
And you don't give out Lakers tickets either.
No, we certainly don't.
Stop doing that. Yeah.
No, and I don't think anyone on the surgeon side even expects that anymore. It was kind of a non-issue.
Well.
You can give me the Lakers tickets.
Dr. Chow?
I just have one specific question, another more general.
No.
Just have to-
You want to
Before I
identify?
do that, though, I have to disclose. So my name is Ed Chow. I'm retired. I'm not a physician. I'm an engineer. I work with pretty basic medical institutions.
One of the most distinguished engineers in the country, actually. But go
Yeah, I
ahead.
spent 21 years at Mayo and 15 years at Harvard. And I worked with industry a lot, and I always was the bad notion that there shouldn't be any cap in medical device. I always used the example of cortisol. The patent was sold for $1. That wasn't so much of respected where I was. In fact, in the early 1980s, Mayo was absolutely refused to have any industrial relationship. I was the one that started. Look at this. There's a bad. But anyway, that's sort of my background. And I'd like to ask a specific question for Ted. I have a long relationship with children. You mentioned about the new mechanism, ways that you work with academic fields. I'd like to get your comment on the model that Field Foundation and SIM has been using for the past 30, 20 years. I'd like to have you comment on that. If you don't know about it, if you imagine it, I think help you with. Finally, the general question I asked the academy briefly mentioned the artist view. I would like to ask all speakers, why not today? The issue of cost have anything to do with this. All the projects and so forth here are actually financially related. And we would learn from my own profession as an engineer. If you could make medical devices better, more reliable, but cheaper, we probably would not have this. So I'd like to hear some comments from the industry, from the attorney's office, lawmaking organizations. Why aren't we learning from engineers that you can make safer, more effective devices for men?
As far as the Synthes AO, I'm somewhat familiar with that foundation structure, not intimately. I think the issue I have and what I know about that is it truly independent? I know they try to set it up that way, but as I understand, they've done a good job of training physicians and even their salespeople through that model, but I'm not that close to it to be able to pierce it.
Because I served on the Field Foundation for more than 8 years. What it is, or was, is a foundation that's formed by a group of surgeons who are trying to promote surgical techniques, implants, and fracture management. What they have is developed certain patents, whatever, and then essentially sold to the manufacturer, in this case, physical therapy. And then the royalty they got is just for research and education. And you are right. It's not really that transparent that the foundation and the company are so separate. There are tremendous relationships in between. When I was serving on the board, I really resent that. So therefore, looking at your model, something about so-called company foundation relationship is not really pure all.
Yeah, we've contemplated setting up, the Zimmer Foundation that would do this, and it would be comprised of an independent board of people that aren't part of the company. But I think in those models, you're always going to be viewed as, oh, come on, it's an independent charitable foundation, but it's really Zimmer. It's really the same thing with a disguise around it to make it look like it's independent. So we've just decided not even to go there. I don't want to criticize Synthes. I think they've done good things with that, but that's the reason why we've chosen not to take that route.
Can I respond to your question about the money? And I don't know if this addresses all of the issues, but I've never prosecuted a kickback case where the underlying economics did not involve huge markups. The reason is simple. You have a huge markup. And by the way, the responsibility for that markup is not just on industry's part. Medicare sometimes overpays for certain types of devices. They overpay for certain types of drugs. And because of that, it is in those items. I mean, you don't see physicians who, frankly, have had their reimbursement dramatically cut for the last 10 years in this kind of situation. It's the devices and the drugs that have been overpaid by the payers. And Medicare can easily be considered one of the first culprits. And what happens is you've got that money there, the big markup, and it creates sort of a trail of I make $500 for every one of these things that I sell. And so the incentive, of course, is to start shaking down the sales rep to try to get his commission. So say a doctor's making that decision, they know it, and they're going to shake him down. Okay, that is a honeypot that's creating a huge problem for corruption. And first case I had out of the box as a prosecutor with the U.S. Attorney's Office involved with butyrol sulfate. You can buy it for 9-10 cents a milliliter at Walmart. Medicare was reimbursing 43 cents a milliliter. Well, guess what? DME companies were getting bribed by pharmaceutical companies or mail order pharmacies to basically refer the patients. You start to buy and sell the patients. That's what it's all about. And it only is economic to do that when there's a big markup.
We're nearing the end here. Let's take one or two more questions. And then... Yes.
How far do we go?
Well, the inherent conflict of interest to start with is doing piecework, right? I mean, the more you do, the more you make. So we don't want to add to that this other layer that we're talking about. As far as the piecework goes, most patients, before the operation even occurs, they know how much it costs when they check with insurance, and they know what their deductible is. So, and when patients ask, no, I don't know. Usually, patients will ask frequently how much this costs. They'll ask directly, "What is this going to cost?" And I'll say. Well, no, it's not in their hands, but the surgical patients, in my experience, I'd say half of them, they want to know, they either know from what they're going to check, what their deductible is, they're going to get an EOB seeing what was paid. The pre-authorization will have a code to it, and they'll sometimes look at that. And sometimes they'll just outright ask, what's this going to cost me? What is the operation cost? What is it going to cost me? That discussion comes up a lot more, and it's actually in the last year and a half I've noticed that comes up a lot more in the office. But as far, well, no, it's mostly. Well, no, the insurance payment plus their deductible. So they're pretty wise about it these days. As far as conflicts of interest, if you're a consultant for some company or not, I'm not, but I think you can be as much of a consultant as you want, but the idea here is that a patient, for example, you saw the article in the Orange County Register a month or so ago. I think patients have a right to know if you're a distributor for a product that you're going to put in that patient and directly make more money putting it in than not putting it in. I think they have a definite right to know that you own that distributorship and you're putting that in. And I think it should be in writing. I think it's obscene if you don't know it. I think if you're a consultant for a company and you are putting in, and not a distributorship, but putting in a product, my opinion is the patient should know that you get $300,000 a year for being a consultant for Acme company, and I'm going to use Acme pedicle screws on you. I don't see any gray zone for that.
I think it's fitting standpoint of the financial interest which made the decision of patient relations, whether they're getting payment talking about the procedure, the context of the implementation in the office, we're talking about the treatment that is procedure. And certainly, we know that where there are more obstetricians, there are more
Absolutely. I mean, for doing the procedure itself, the conflict of whether, the question of lumbar spine fusions at all, patients can be manipulated into getting done whatever you want to happen to them. You can tell them, the literature says you should have this done, this is going to take care of you, and it's going to work great, whether we put something instrument in or not. I mean, if you're ethical about it, I don't know how to have people not do that, but if you're ethical about it, you're really going to tell them what the literature says. You may have a 70% chance of getting better if we do this. You may have this possibility or that. There's so much latitude within each patient-physician relationship for corruption, really, of moral values that it can go based on really the personality of the surgeon, the doctor. And I don't think it's limited to surgery, but
one more quick point on Medicare. There's a trend. You're looking at outcomes. You were talking earlier about evidence-based medicine. Is that in terms of watching out for Medicare dollars, this is one method to do that. Looking at outcome measures. I mean, people are I get the same Medicare. Less than that, same expertise or outcomes. We're having a blanket training to people, physicians, not for procedures that may not have.
well, thanks. I think we're going to wrap this up. It's 12:28. Before I just have a couple comments, but before I mention these, everybody should remember to fill out the CME forms on the way out for evaluating the symposium. We would appreciate that. And I hope we can bring the ideas and discussions that we had today and practical solutions to come up with a set of rules, basically, for interacting with industry. And I think that is what's needed. Namely, industry should be really involved in medicine, but it should be regulated by medicine, so it's for the purpose of patient care, patient advancement, and not for company shareholders, which should be secondary. And I think there's also a cry of stifling innovation by having some regulation of this interaction is hollow and disingenuous. I don't think it does. In fact, I think it will level the playing field. Rushing dangerous, unproven, enormously expensive items through the FDA to the for the sake of industry profit to the American public needs to be ended. I think we've discussed examples of that today. At least I have. Towards that end, as you mentioned, we set up a central website under the name Association for Medical Ethics, where there will be all physicians listed that will be required under the Sunshine Act when that gets passed. That will be readily accessible by the public and physicians. And we will also make available the rules of engagement when we come up with them for industry and medicine to have as a reference. And we'll be going back and forth over emails with all the participants in today's symposium to come up with that. I sincerely believe that hopefully this is a first step today in changing the direction of medicine, which is my intent, and I think it's the intent of a number of people here today, so that we don't have this huge waste of money in this country where 47 million American citizens remain uninsured, which is a disgrace. And certainly financially, the current course of expenditures is not sustainable. Thank you all for coming, and I greatly wish to thank the participants for coming, flying in from all over, getting the lectures ready, and contributing to help solve what I think we all feel is a critical issue. Thank you.